Um, let's start again.
Okay.
How are you, Grandma?
I am fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really happy to be here and talking to you.
Well, I am happy to have you here.
So we just started by asking you, what is your full name?
Sue Irene King Hu.
And where were you born?
Prince Frederick, Maryland, about 10 miles up the road in a building that is still standing, although no longer used for a hospital.
Sheriff's office, right?
Sheriff's office.
Yeah. So you grew up on a farm.
That's correct.
And what is your birthday?
Oh, November 7th, 1938.
A week before mine?
Ah, yes, a week before yours. I will never be able to forget your birthday. It's kind of interesting with all the political things that have happened recently. It made me realize that I was born 73 years after the end of the Civil War.
Yeah, wow.
And when you put that into cultural context and historical context, you can see, it explains a lot of things. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. What was it like growing up on a farm? Like, what was your daily routine like?
Well, I was a girl. It probably would have been different if I'd been a boy. Although, I can never remember a time when I did not have jobs to do. And I think that sort of was the marker for farms of that time, where children from the time they could toddle had some task that they learned to do, and then that expanded as they grew older.
Right. You didn't have running water when you first were...
Actually, we did, because that was the first thing that they did, was to put water in the house.
Oh.
And the other thing that was different, a lot of the neighbors did not have running water in the house. And I can remember ones that did not. And also did not have electricity either. And most people used kerosene lamps. But my father had we would call it a generator now. The name he gave to it was the light plant. And that generated electricity, so we had a refrigerator that worked. That was the primary, and electric lights. So it's the lights in the refrigerator that were the two primary things that worked off that generator, and the pump that pumped the water from the well.
Right.
Because we had well water.
Right. So growing up, like being born in the 30s, and then you were growing up like as a child right during World War II. How did like big world events like that affect you in like your rural life?
I do remember my father served in the reserves, and I remember 2 times where he had to go away for some weekend exercises. And I remember that, and he had a uniform. So it was like probably I don't remember what they called it, but it was like the home guard or the home reserves. And I remember that. I also remember blackouts, that at night you had to be sure all the lights were off. And I do remember one night when a huge dirigible flew over. And of course now you almost never see a dirigible except when they want to advertise something, like some car dealer or something like that. But other than that, you don't hear about dirigibles anymore. But I remember that one because it was this huge, dark shape in the sky.
What is a dirigible? It's like a blimp?
Yes, like a blimp.
Oh,
right,
okay.
Right.
How did you get your news when you were on the farm? Was it by radio or newspaper? Or?
A combination. Of course, TV did not come in until 45, 46. And we weren't one of the first ones to get one either. My uncle got one, and when we would go to visit on Sunday, we would see it, and the quality of the picture, it was black and white, and they were even further from broadcast than we were, so the quality of the picture was not particularly good. I mean, you could see it, and the audio was okay, but so initially it was the Baltimore Sun newspaper, the radio, and that was pretty much it. And then there was a local county paper that came once a week.
So what was it like working on the farm? Because you said you had jobs, and I remember specifically our first time doing this interview that you had to help with the tobacco harvest.
Well, I had to help with all parts of it. I mean, essentially, the raising of tobacco as a crop had not changed significantly from colonial times. Now that sounds really crazy, but there wasn't. It was all hand labor. So it explains why the generation before me, people had a lot of children. You needed labor to help do it, and so you needed help to plant it. You needed help to sometimes to put they used poison to get rid of the tobacco worms, which of course now we know is not such a good idea for a whole lot of reasons, in harvesting it, and then in the final, after the tobacco was cured, to take the leaves off the stalk and get it ready for market. And of course we had no boys in the family, and I was the oldest child, so guess what? My father did hire mostly African American labor on a daily basis because the farms here were small. When I say small, anywhere from 100, 200 acres, might be up to some bigger farms might be 300, 400. Unlike the South, where the farms that raised tobacco were a lot larger, and the kind of tobacco they raised was a little different as well, and the process was a little different because they did a fire in the barn to cure the tobacco, whereas here tobacco was air cured. So all the barns here had they called them shutters that opened, and we had these large, they called them buttons, but they were like huge wooden pieces that closed it off, and then would allow you, of course, to open the barn and allow air to flow through, because tobacco, when it was cut, was green, and so if you take a lot of green plant of any kind, and you stuff a barn full of it, if you don't get air flowing through it, it would rot. So the idea was to hang the tobacco in the barn. If you ever went into a barn, that you'd see these poles. They go all the way up to the top of the barn. Most barns took 3 people. Occasionally one took 4 people in the barn. I mean, up above the level of your head. And that was the level I stood on when I had to do that. My father did not take me up further up in the barn. And he was the one that went up to the top. And when they were hanging tobacco in the very top of the barn, they called it crowning the barn. When you crown the barn, you wanted to have typically at least 3 people, plus somebody on the ground who was passing it up to the person on the first level, who would then put it up to the person on the second level, who would then send it up to the person on the third level.
Right. You said that you had hired help on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
What was that relationship like between being like the family on the farm and the hired help?
Okay, well, one thing that our farm had, not every farm had it, but ours did, we had a tenant farmer, and the relationship and the the guidelines or the criteria were different, were developed, which was a relationship, and every relationship was different. What my father did was it was a small house. It did not have running water. It did have its own well, and the tenant would stay there with his family. He was not charged rent, and he was given, what my father did was to give him a certain piece of tobacco that was totally his, and the rest of it, he got a portion, a small portion. But he had one field of tobacco that was totally his. And when we went out to work in the field or in the barn, it didn't make a difference whose you were putting in there. I mean, nobody stopped to say, is this his or ours? You know, you just went out and you just did it. And so, but it was that operation worked that way all the way from colonial times. The difference being that we got some technology along the way. A pair of oxen with an ox cart to and a horse with a plow, and then you moved up and you got a truck and a tractor. And the tobacco planters were pulled by horses in the beginning, and then that transferred to a tractor. Yeah. So it's that kind of mechanization that actually moved the process along a little bit and made it somewhat easier. Right. But I can remember when my father started plowing the fields in January with a horse and plow so that he would be finished by the end of March.
Mm-hmm. So you remember a horse and plow?
Oh, yeah.
Before a tractor.
Yes. And I remember when the tobacco planter was pulled by a team of horses. It had a barrel of water that sat horizontally, and then it had two seats behind. And there was a section between the two seats, and the two people sitting on the seats had a burlap sack with a load of plants on your lap, and then we took turns going down the row to plant the plants. And then you get to the end, and the thing would turn around, and you come back across the field. And I can assure you that your fingers were plenty sore by the end of the day.
Yeah, sounds like hard work.
Yes.
What was you've told me a story before about a family member of the hired help, the tenant farmer, mm-hmm. Who sat at the wrong table.
Oh, yes.
Do you mind telling that story?
I'll be happy to. There was, I can even add something to that story that happened since. There were two families that lived on a road that adjoined the road that went past the farm. And those two farms, they were small farms, and the families had done very well. And they educated, the kids finished high school, and they went on to college. And the one son was actually in college. He became a doctor. But he was working for my father when he was home from school to pick up money. And so he and my father come in for lunch, and it was customary at that time that the farmer's family would have a table, and then there would be a separate table for the help. Well, my mother went ahead and set up the table in the porch for the help, and when they came in, he followed my father into the kitchen, and my father said, "Your table is out there." And I to this day, I don't know why, but it just hit me all wrong. I thought that something is funny about this. And the interesting thing is that my sister, who is 7 years younger than I am, I must have been maybe 14 or 15 when that happened. But she remembers it just like I do.
Wow. Very impactful moment.
Yes, very impactful moment. And it just made me feel like this just doesn't sit right. Yeah. Just doesn't sit right. The addendum to that story is it's been at least 3 years ago, because it's pre-pandemic. We were in the dining room here one night and eating with dinner with friends of ours, and there was an African American couple sitting having dinner together, and people we were eating dinner with had had dinner with them the night before, and they were prospective people who were looking at Asbury as a possible place to move. Whether how soon, I don't know any of the details, but so our friend got up, went over, and said, "Come over, I'd like for you to meet friends of ours." And so it turns out he was from the county, and I said, "Where did you live?"
Was he one of the...
He was that guy.
He was that guy?
He was that guy.
Wow.
Now, I know he knew just like I did, and neither one of us said anything.
Really?
What could you say? There is nothing you could say. I mean, could you say, can we erase history? No, we can't erase history. But I know he knew, just like I knew.
And how did you know it was him? Was it the same name?
Yes.
Okay.
The same surname. And I said, "And I think you work for my dad." And he said, "I did."
Wow.
And that was as close as we came to acknowledging what had happened that day.
That's a lot of deep history to try to acknowledge.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that. Well, and people here, it's very hard for people who didn't grow up here to understand the culture of this. I mean, so much has been made of what went on in the South. And I'm not trying to say that what went on was right, because it wasn't. Absolutely not. And some of the feelings were more deep-rooted on both sides. But, I mean, I never thought about it, particularly growing up. I mean, about, do you treat somebody differently or not? I mean, I know that my parents were very careful your grandparents, are very careful to make sure that we were respectful, and that that was just the way you treated people. It wasn't something that was pointed out, well, now you need to treat them a certain way, because that wasn't the case.
That it was like a base set of manners for everybody.
Yeah, it was like a base set of manners. Now, but on the other hand, my parents would not have invited them to come home and have dinner in the dining room with us either.
Right.
But they did interesting things. The man who lived in that tenant house the longest had a common law wife, which was very common at that point, and a bunch of kids. And his father, who was deeply religious, kept pushing him to get married. So they finally decided they were going to tie the knot. And my mother and I made the wedding cake.
Oh, nice.
So, I mean, there are little things like that. Now, not everybody would have done that, but we did.
Yeah.
And I do know that when he finally passed away, long after I had left home, my mother went to the funeral, and she was the only white person in that church.
Wow.
So that says something about where it all came from.
Yeah. But you didn't stay on the farm, and you wanted to go to college. And what was that like to have that conversation between your parents that you wanted to go to college and leave the farm? Well,
there's a couple of things. First of all, when I went to high school, there was one high school in this county. The population was 1/5 of what it is now. So you figure, all right, then it might have been like, maybe 18,000 total, and now you multiply it by 5, or maybe it was even more at this point. But so when you went to high school, there was one high school, and they have torn the building down now, but there were 54 people in my graduating class for an entire county. I think part of it was because we were like World War II, pre-World War II. that probably accounted for some of it. But so I knew people from all over the county because they all went there. The only exception, there was a Catholic high school at Solomon's, a very small Catholic high school at Solomon's. But other than that, it was everybody went to, and it was a junior senior high school. So you entered as a seventh grader and left when you graduated.
Yeah, the full length.
The
of junior
full
high
length
to high
of
school.
yep. It was Calvert County Junior Senior High School.
But you.
And I should add this to it too. The girls, most of them took a commercial coursework with the idea of going to work in Washington, D.C. And I would say almost all of them, because out of my class of 54, 2 people went to college. And I was one of the 2.
Right.
And some of the guys went later after, because a lot of them would, if they didn't stay on the farm or in business with somebody, would go into the military. And they used their military benefits to come back and go to college. And I know several who did that.
Right, like the GI Bill.
Right, exactly.
And so a lot of those commercial jobs, would that be like secretarial positions?
Secretarial stuff, FBI, a lot of the agencies in D.C., but FBI was a big one.
Yeah.
They hired a lot of the girls from down here. And the girls would live at home and have carpools that went into the city and came home.
And did I think I remember you telling me that your dad wanted you to become a secretary, right?
Well, I don't know what he wanted. I mean, he went through school as far as 8th grade. So, he couldn't see beyond where he had been. My mother, on the other hand, had graduated summa cum laude from what was then Western Maryland College. It's now McDaniel University. It's up in Westminster, Maryland. So, I mean, her horizons were a little broader, and she knew that opportunities, particularly for girls, would be much better if I got a college education and had opportunities that I wouldn't have if I stayed here.
Right. I do remember you telling me a story, though, about you confronting your father about that idea that you wanted to go to college.
Yes, that's true. It was what it was is that my father was extremely frugal. He got where he got, as the saying goes, by earning every penny that he needed to get there. No one gave him a sum of money to get started or whatever. I mean, he borrowed the money to buy the farm. And so he was very careful, and given the fact that he got paid once a year, that would be very understandable. You'd be very careful about how your money went out the door. So he had no idea what it cost. So to him, and we would laugh at it today, I think the cost of a semester was something like $1,200. I know. And now I'm going to a state school because I went to Towson, what's now Towson State University, and I got a scholarship. So we're talking about $1,200, which today it makes us sit and laugh.
Right. Yeah.
But to him that was a lot of money for a girl. I mean, he didn't say for a girl, but I know that was in his head. So I remember standing in the middle of the living room floor with my hands on my hips and saying, I don't want to be a secretary. I want to be a teacher. And so, at that, I think he gave up. I think my mother said, give up, fella. Yeah. Anyway, so and there were not many opportunities for women either. I mean, you're either going to be a secretary or a teacher or a nurse. And so, pick one. So I became the teacher, and my sister, who is 7 years younger than I, became the nurse.
Did you know though at that moment that you had an interest in teaching?
Yes, I joined the Future Teachers of America in high school. They did have a chapter, and the English teacher that I had was a sponsor. And we went to future teacher events a couple times. So, I had some idea of, of what it would be. I didn't have a lot of experience. I had done a little bit of teaching Sunday school, teaching vacation Bible school, a little bit of that. But that was about as much practical experience as I had until I got to college.
Well, let's talk about college. How did you like your college experience, and what got you to fall in love with like how teaching works and all of that?
Well, it was interesting. It was mostly girls at the time I was there. That situation has certainly righted itself because Towson State University, I don't know what the numbers look like now, but it certainly is a more even split between men and women. It was a steep learning curve for me because I came from a small county high school, and sometimes I had to sit and watch because I had absolutely no experience with especially in the beginning. I learned that the best thing to do is keep your mouth shut and your head down and watch. I had a biology professor, and this is going to sound funny to you based on how things turned out. A biology professor he was not a very big man. His name was McDowell, and he was sarcastic to the nines. So, I had never used a microscope. And the kids in class who came from like Baltimore City and larger counties, I mean, they could give lessons in how to do a microscope. I know how to use a microscope. That was hard. And it did not endear me to a love of biology, which actually was your grandmother's love when she was in college. She majored in biology and loved it. And I think I would have loved it a lot earlier if I had a better instructor. Mm. So the love had to develop later in a different way.
Right. But you, like growing up on a farm, I think you had an appreciation for animals. Right?
Oh yeah, animals and plants and finding cool things. One thing I did do among my mother's belongings from college. She had 2 little insect boxes that were like this, and she had to do an insect collection, and I got really interested in that, and so I did insect collection, and actually my father had them build me an insect box. Had a friend of his who did carpentry stuff build me an insect box, and that box is probably about yay long and about yay big. And I would, classify them into the different families and label them with the scientific names. So, I really got into it. And it kind of hooked your father on it a little bit because he started doing that. I interested, him and Sharon in doing, just being interested in looking at it, like butterflies and moths and as something that was just interesting, but unusual. Maybe you don't see it very often,
right?
A kind of thing. And I think that really, it came to fruition when I had children of my own and went back to teaching. I think that's where the focus really came together, because I taught for 3 years and stopped and had children when that was fashionable. And when I went back in, I had a different perspective because I had children of my own. And I think that gives you a whole different way of looking at things and of trying to engage kids, because I had a background of experience just dealing with my own.
Yeah, skipping ahead a little bit to going back into teaching. My dad was telling me on our way here that you actually went into some of his classrooms and was basically a teaching aide.
Yes, that is correct.
And volunteering also. Was it difficult to become a stay-at-home mom and then go back into the workforce? Was that a difficult transition?
No, actually, when Stephen and Sharon started school, I went in and helped in the classroom. And I did a lot of things in the classroom because I had a teaching background. The teachers could give me something to do that perhaps they would not have given somebody else. And so I did a lot of things with them. And then there was a period of time where, I guess within 2 years, we had about half a dozen couples that we knew of where either the husband died or the parents got divorced. And the thought that kept nagging me was, what if something happened to us and I had to provide for your dad and Sharon? And I thought, this will not do. And especially if we're going to send them to college, one income, it was becoming obvious that if you wanted to send them to college, one income wasn't going to cut it. Now, to be fair about it, at that time, Papa, your grandfather, was going to night school, and that's how he got his master's degree, and it took him 8 years because he was going to school at night. So, of course, that meant I was covering everything on the home front, so he could go to school at night. And we had a room in the house where he had his desk, and we had a little desk right beside, and that's where your father would come and sit. And he was studying like his dad was studying. I mean, that's what he said he was doing. Anyway, but that's the idea. I mean, it's really hard unless you have a lot of family support to have both of you going to school at the same time. Some's got to give somewhere. So mine sat on the back burner, and he went to school and he got his master's degree, and of course that helped him move on through his career. So it was not. So then I went back. Eventually, I started as an aide in the school where your dad and Sharon went to school, and then it was under a grant program that finally was slowly eliminated. And I thought, if I'm going to be here doing this, I might as well go back in the classroom full time. So I only had a couple of classes to pick up and get myself certified for the state of Virginia, because every state does its own certification. So I got certified for the state of Virginia, and then I got myself hired.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, it worked.
Talking about Pawpaw, let's go back to the college years, because you met, and then you didn't actually get into a relationship together until years after you met, right?
That's right. He was 3 years ahead of me, so he was almost ready to graduate at the time that I was entering Towson. But there was a college-age group that met in a church across from Johns Hopkins University, which is his alma mater, on Sunday night, and students came from all over the city, and it was a big social thing. They did serious programs, but it was a real meeting place for college students. And he knew me, and I knew him. I knew who he was, and he knew who I was, but he didn't ask me out. And it was not until I was a senior.
What were your first impressions of Pawpaw?
Nice guy. Didn't know him very well. He asked me out, and when I was a senior, and if you were to do something like this, your parents would probably cream you with a brick. But he proposed 3 weeks after we started going out, and I was crazy enough to accept him.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Personally, I thank you for that.
I know it's kind of humorous, and it's lasted 62 years, so it must be good for something.
Did Pawpaw meet your parents before he proposed?
No.
And what was that meeting like?
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They just didn't know. I'm trying to think now. I just, well, my parents didn't know what to make of it. That's to be honest. They had never met anybody who was Asian. I mean, so the starting bar was pretty far down, pretty far down. So they, and my mother had all kinds of fears about he would take me away to China and she'd never see me again, kind of stuff, which of course is crazy. So they had never met anybody who was Asian. So when I made it clear that, I mean, if you decide you're going to do this, you can't half do it. You've got to commit to it. And if you're not going to commit to it, please don't go there. Because, it's like, I tell people it's like the North Pole married the South Pole. Because he came from a large city, and I came from country.
Yeah.
And the culture's very different, although his family, for an Asian family, was probably a lot more liberal, and I don't know if I would call it Americanized, but I would certainly call it more liberal, because his father had graduated with a degree in public health, a doctorate in public health. And so he worked for a number of research firms, and then in fact he went to China. That's how your great-grandparents met.
And my great-grandma, Papa's mother, had a degree as well.
That's right. Correct? She went to a school in China that was run by missionaries, one of whom was from Baltimore. And I had the privilege of course, Papa took me to meet her because when he came to go to Hopkins, she was living in Baltimore with her daughter, and we went to their house for dinner, and she was very gracious, but she was instrumental in getting Dick's mother to come to the U.S. to go to school. Now, his dad was Chinese, born in Hawaii, and so he came to the mainland to go to school, but they didn't know each other. Got their degrees, went to Shanghai, she to teach and he to work in a research firm, Leicester Institute, which I think was run by Scotland, actually. Anyway, they were introduced in Shanghai, and they got married, and they lived in Shanghai through the Second World War. So there's all kinds of stories that, about how it was when you lived there. And a lot of people who were foreigners were put in detention camps. And he remembers going with his father to one of those camps to visit his father's boss. And my question was, well, why didn't they put your father in a camp like that? He said, well, these Chinese, they all look alike. So anyway, they stayed in China, and after the war, when it became obvious that the political situation was not good, the other thing that was in question was because his dad was an American citizen by birth, having been born in Hawaii, which was a territory, but that still made him a citizen. The children had to live in the United States 5 years before they turned 21.
Right.
So if you put those two things together, there was an optimum time to leave.
Yeah.
And so they came back to Hawaii, where his mother lived. His father his grandmother was in Hawaii.
Right.
His grandfather had passed away. Anyway, so they came back to Hawaii. His father became Commissioner of Public Health for the Territory of Hawaii, and was there until Dick got almost ready to go to college, and then he took a position with the Agency for International Development to go and set up malaria eradication programs in a lot of countries, and that was what he did. Interestingly enough, he liked insects, but Papa does not.
Not a fan.
To this day, no, that was not something he wanted to do. He would go with him, but he didn't like the bugs.
Yeah. So you got married
Yep.
in the same church that you met,
Yes,
correct?
that is correct. Which, by the way, to add to that, eventually the church building was sold because the population sort of dwindled as more people sort of left the city at one point. And so Johns Hopkins University bought it, and they turned it into a interfaith center. And we actually went in and when they had a homecoming, one of the years we went up there, and they had a revolving altar to take care of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
like a mechanized altar.
Yeah,
Oh,
that
that's so
you could
funny.
turn around depending on what you,
I'm guessing you chose the Christian altar for
Yes.
the marriage.
Well, of course, when we were there, it was only a church,
Oh, right.
and this use of it came much later.
Right.
But yeah, it's kind of interesting. We have pictures on that rolling picture frame out there that are wedding pictures.
That's funny.
Yeah, that is very funny.
You had a honeymoon in Mexico.
Went to Mexico. I had the first scare of my life. Somehow, in the scheme of things, probably I was naive, but my wallet disappeared, and I had no ID at all.
Passport was in there. Everything.
Everything was in there. At that point, I don't think you had to have a passport to get into Mexico. You did have to have, but see, I had my social security card. Everything was in there. I didn't have anything. I had nothing to say who I was. And at this point, and I mean, this day and age, you would not be allowed back in this country if you come up to the border. I don't have any papers. Good luck. But anyway, so somehow or other we got back in. The irony was, a year later, I got this fat envelope in the mail. And it had been mailed to me by some lady in New York who had said she found these papers in her front yard.
In New York?
In New York.
So they got from Mexico to New York, and then she mailed them back to you?
Well, now, what we don't know, and we'll never know, I reported it, of course, because of the Social Security issue with it. But there was no way to know whether she was the person who used it or whether she literally had found them on the ground because somebody had thrown it away.
Wow.
We'll never know.
So you never found the wallet, but you got the papers back? Some of the
That's right.
papers back?
Uh-huh.
Wow, that is...
Isn't that wild?
That's pretty scary.
Yes. Well, and then you don't know who had it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it was reported. So
when I find a Suhu down in Mexico who's stolen your identity.
Well, they can't. It would be somewhere in this country.
Yeah, apparently.
It would be somewhere in this country.
That's very strange. I never knew that.
I know, that is kind of wild.
So then you were married for a few years. You said you were teaching for a few years before you had children.
Yeah.
And then having children. What was your favorite part about being a mom?
Being able to do things with my kids. I really enjoyed that part of it. I don't think I would trade it because I mean, the circumstances now are so different, and people, what worked for us would certainly perhaps not work for people now. But you could survive on one income if the income was a decent one. And we did a lot of simple things. We did camping, and we did hiking, and all of those things don't cost a lot of money to do. And I think you learn to appreciate things a little differently that way. And I wasn't accustomed to having a lot of expensive stuff, so I didn't need to go there. But I really enjoyed. We did a lot of things they learn to, you like to bake cookies, and I know at Christmas time I have this fruitcake recipe, which hopefully I will get good enough on my feet to stand and do it again. I would make fruitcake at Christmas time. We'd make them for their teachers, and we'd have a session where they would help me make those, and then they would get to take one to their teacher. So I think what it does, it transmits the feeling of I don't know if I want to say compassion, or engaging and relating to people. I don't know, but I felt like it was definitely worth it to spend the time at home with the kids. And then I felt okay going back, because at that point they had some independence, which didn't mean that they didn't need me anymore, because I would come home at night and after I went back to work, and I would always check in with them, before I sat down to do whatever I had to do. So the kids still came first.
Right. What do you feel like the difference was for you between being a mom for a daughter and being a mom for a son?
I think it's based on a couple of things. Part of it, of course, is gender, but I think part of it is the personality and chemistry of the individual. I mean, you know Sharon, and you know your dad, and they're very different people, and I don't think it's just simply a gender thing. I think obviously that's the obvious, but they do have some other traits that are somewhat similar. They engage with other people, and I have had. I think they're very family oriented. I think that is one value that Dick and I had in common, is that we valued family, and he would go to bat to do what was necessary for what was needed. And that came, and you don't realize that when you are rearing children yourself, but it comes back to roost, as one says. I remember when Papa's parents, when his mother was at the end of her life. It was his father had passed away, and she was living alone, and it was hard to get her to do the things she needed to do. And we always went over, even when his dad was alive, and we had to do things. We would go over as a family, and we would do things with him, and we'd have a meal with him. And then when his father passed away, we'd go and do things for her. And I remember when your dad came home from college, he would take your grandmother to Chinese restaurant for lunch. And the fact that he would do that, I mean, that isn't always the norm for college kids.
Yeah.
A lot of them can't be bothered with people who are older. And I think that's something that is, well, it was true from the background I came from, but it's also true in Asian cultures, where older people are valued in a way that it isn't always the case. I've seen too many instances where it's not. And then it came to play, what goes around comes around. Last summer, when I was in healthcare for 3 months, your dad and Sharon were here every weekend. I mean, between the two of them, they covered it. And I know that wasn't easy, and I know they could certainly have found other things to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think this recording probably shows you that it's rubbed off on me as well,
Right.
That I think there's there's a lot to be said for respecting your family and being there for your family.
And appreciating what people before you, what they were like and what they contributed to the person you are.
Right.
Because I've always said that the best gift to give to particularly the grandchildren now was what you give of yourself. And I don't know how far back you can remember when you and Simon came to stay at the house in Northern Virginia.
Oh, I remember a lot. I remember going to the pond. I remember the animal collection in the basement. I remember a lot of that. All those tapes you had of all those nature tapes. I remember a lot of that.
Right. And I started doing that. That was totally my idea of engaging you. When Simon must have been about 2.5, I said to your dad and to your mom, I said, how about if we take him for a weekend? And I don't care what you do with your time. I'll come get him on Friday and bring him back on Sunday, or you can come get him on Sunday. So we eventually we'd have a meal together on Sunday, whether they came to us or we went to you. But the thing was that it was a win-win in my book, because your parents got some free time. They didn't have to pay a babysitter. You got some experiences, which you probably wouldn't have had. And we got time with you, which I knew we would value, and that's irreplaceable. You can't get that back.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
And so I will never forget the day that you realized that Simon was going and you weren't. And you threw the temper tantrum to end all temper tantrums.
I was quite a fussy kid.
Well, you were that day. You realized that, hey, he's going and I can't. Why not? Although you didn't put it that way, but it was funny in a sense. But I had gotten tickets to take Simon to see the Velveteen Rabbit, and we only had the 3 tickets, and I knew I couldn't get them any more because it was sold out. So I said, next time you can come. And then the next time, then you both came. And then we have that picture of you two in the bathtub and at the pond and all these other things that we did. And remember getting on Metro and going down to D.C. to the Smithsonian.
Yeah. I mean, that was the best part. Seeing the T-Rex skeleton was the highlight.
Yeah, well, see, you could go and do that kind of stuff. And, I mean, those kinds of things, it's not so much what it is, but it was different than what you were doing at home. Not to make any less of that. It was just different. So you got, I want to say, double the experiences. You got things you did with your parents, and you got things you did with us.
Yeah.
And I think that's a value. And then I remember I came up with the idea of doing things. I started when Simon was in nursery school, bringing the animals to Fredericksburg.
Yep. I still have friends who talk about that. They were like, I remember when your grandma would bring the snakes and turtles into class and you would hold them, and that would be the wildest thing of my year.
But there again, I mean, everybody won. And of course, the fact that I had taught for the state of Virginia, I mean, I'm sitting at home, I've got the standards of learning for the entire state for every grade level. So the way I knew, because there were all these different classes of the same grade level, I thought, well, you can't do it for one class and not do it for the rest. So I said to your parents, I said, all right, you give me a place to stay overnight. We'll find a place at school to lock all that stuff up. And if a teacher is agreeable to be the point of contact, I'm willing to teach all the classes. I don't care. I'll do it for 2 days, and in 2 days we can get 9 or 10 classes done. So I said, have the teacher call me. So the way we got around the principal was, I would say, okay, please tell him that we're doing 3.1, 3.5, and 3.7. And I said what each one of them was. I said, we will be covering these in what I'm doing with the classes. And they always poke their nose in the door because they couldn't believe somebody would be crazy enough to come do that. But, and everybody benefited from it.
Yeah. But it's also, I mean, to me that shows a kind of selfless act by you. Like, that's a lot of your professional experience, and, you did that for free. Like, you weren't getting, paid a bunch of money to go in and show the snakes, but you decided to, help out my curriculum and, again, kind of help out my teachers in teaching, like you did for my dad when he was in school.
Yeah.
So I think there's a huge benefit for that.
Yeah, yeah. Which gets to the point of giving of yourself.
Right.
Because there was no money in that for me. The value to me was what I could do for you and your classes. And I love doing it.
Yeah.
So why not?
I appreciate
it. Well, Simon did too. And we still have pictures. There are pictures on that frame of you guys with the snakes draped around your neck and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I think there was a moment in elementary school where I was like, wait, your grandma doesn't have snakes? That's so weird. She doesn't have turtles? It's very strange. I don't understand that.
Well, and then when you came to the house in Oakton, that house was just a wonderful place to bring kids to do stuff, because all this stuff was outside, and we had ladybugs, and you could find salamanders, and you just could find anything, anywhere, anyhow. Yeah.
And so, do you think that's really your favorite part of being a grandparent, is having those kind of experience and just very valuable moments with the grandchildren?
Yes, because you build a relationship. And the relationship that I have with you and Simon, and it's a different one with Ian and Grace, but because of a lot of things. But I don't think we'd have the relationship we have now if it had not been for all the things that preceded it. The coming to the house on weekends, my coming to your school, all of that stuff, plus all the family time stuff for holidays and things. You put all that together, and you can't go back in time and replicate that. I mean, I knew there would come a time, don't like it particularly, when, that time is a moment in time. Enjoy it, appreciate it, hold on to it for memory's sake. But you have a life to live. You have other things you need to do with your time. So we can't spend the kind of time together that we did at one point in life.
Yeah. Growing up, adult life kind of takes over.
Yeah, well, yes, and you have a different set of responsibilities, but you a part of what you have experienced goes with you. And that is the point. And then part of that experience stays here, stays with us. And I think the thing that bothers me most now with Papa is that he can't remember.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is nothing we can do to make that better. My sister said in a conversation we had earlier this week, she said he's just very lucky to be able to have the best possible life living at home, as opposed to just being in a nursing home somewhere.
Right. And, it's like those weekend moments and all of that. Papa was there too. And so I have a lot of amazing memories with Papa as well. So,
right.
We all feel the love for him still.
Right.
That won't go away,
Right. Yeah, that's part of what is a gift. And I don't think a lot of people understand that you build. It's a gift we're giving, and a gift you are receiving. And hopefully it is a model for you moving forward with your life, however you choose to gift to others as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons you've taught me is appreciating other people and the time they can give you,
Yes.
and the experiences that they can give you.
Right.
Yeah. Speaking of experiences, there was a story that you told me once that I did want to get on camera. That was about when you were teaching, and there was a loose snake that that you decided to wrangle.
Well, I have a couple stories actually. But the one I think you're referring to is the Monday morning when 3 Hispanic boys, I was in a school that had a very high number of minority students, and I was recruited for it, for a science position there. Anyway, so I'm teaching 7th grade life science. So here come on a Monday morning 3 Hispanic boys with this very large cardboard box, which is probably as big as the seat of that chair square. And I said, Mrs. Who, we brought you, we found a snake over the weekend. We thought you'd like to have it. I said, oh, good. Because I had animals in the classroom and I had all kinds of stuff in there. And I said, well, what kind of snake is it? Oh, we don't know. I said, listen, guys. I said, you're bringing me a snake. You don't know what kind it is. He's been in that box, and you bounced that box all the way up here from home. I said, I have a feeling that snake's not a very happy snake right now. So put the box down, and you go to your homeroom, and I will find a cage, and we will see what we have. So I let it sit for a while, and I got a big 50-gallon tank, got it on the table, got a lid for it. So then I proceed to see if I can get in the box. And of course the snake had quieted down. So the trick is I had taken a class, by the way, in reptiles and amphibians. So I knew what you have to do is get him behind the head so that he can't get you. It was a northern water snake is what it was.
Venomous, right?
No, they're not venomous,
Okay.
but they're not friendly either. And all, as you will recall, all snakes have teeth, and those teeth can get you. So I caught him behind the head, got him in there, got him into the tank, and got the lid on. So I decided I was going to make that a teaching moment. So I said, okay. So every class that came in, I took 10 minutes at the end that day, and I did it with every single class. And we talked about the pros and cons of adding that snake to what we had in the classroom. And we came to the same conclusion, which we took a vote at the end of class, and that was that was not a good place for the snake. The cage we had was not big enough for it, even though it was a big cage. What do you feed it? How we're going to have enough food here for it? All these things came up, and it was decided that the snake needed to go back to Glencarlin Park, which is where the boys had found it. So I said, meet me after school. I said, we have a little friend to return back to his home. And that's what we did with it. And it was a lesson for all kinds of reasons. The environmental one was, but also it showed the kids that I wasn't afraid to take it on either. Because I think those boys thought they were going to intimidate me with this big snake.
With a giant snake.
And they got fooled.
Yeah. What were some other funny teaching moments?
Well, another one had a lot to do with animals. I forget what the lesson even was, but somebody said, Mrs. Who, whatever the snake's name was, is sitting on top of the cage back there. I said, no problem, and I just kept on talking, walked back, picked him up, put him in the cage, put the rock back on the top where it should have been in the first place, and kept right on going. It didn't bother me at all.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. Another thing I did, we had an activity period time where, it was a class, but it was not a class for a grade. It was exposure to other things. And it was a time when the Audubon bird prints were on exhibit at the East Gallery of Art in D.C. So I went down there and I walked around and I kind of made up a little tour, and then I arranged to take kids down there. And I had them work in twos. They had one thing I learned about field trips is you don't ever take kids on field trips with nothing to do. That's a recipe for disaster. So I had it done like a little scavenger hunt. So they had to go around and they had to be able to tell one thing about each of the things and I let them work in pairs because that way you could pair kids up so nobody was, left struggling. I figured you put two heads together, you'd come up with something. They had to turn it into me. They had to get credit for having done it. But I had total strangers walk up to me that day and say, "What school are you guys from?" And I told them, and they said, "We've never seen kids act like this in a museum," which was pretty funny.
Yeah.
But it's because they had a purpose. They had a goal, and I made it fun, and they enjoyed it. And probably, I'm sure most of those kids had never been in the National Gallery of Art before in their life.
Yeah, I always love field trips like that.
Yeah,
those are really fun.
Yeah.
So after you were done teaching and you retired, you and Papa, from the gallery behind you in the living room, you travel a lot, and to a lot of different places: Alaska, India, China.
Yeah.
What were some of your favorite moments while traveling?
I liked them all for different reasons. I liked the trip to Alaska. We went all the way up to the northernmost point in Alaska, and it's the place in the Inuit language, the native language up there. It's the place to find snowy owls, and we actually saw snowy owls when we were up there. But what interested me though was that, of course, up there, they have to buy their food, order it, so it comes in on a ship like once or twice a year. They have a grocery store, but the price is in there. You don't want to go buy something unless you really need to. And they had like cellars that they had dug outside the homes, which was dug down. It was like a freezer. And they would go hunting because they were allowed to have subsistence hunting. And they would bring back and they would cut up the meat and freeze it and put there. And I've often thought about that as we're having this global warming, what happens to that way of life. But what it reminded me of really was Smith Island, because that's a subsistence way of living too, in a way. And they would have all their equipment like outside their houses. And on Smith Island, they do the same thing.
What is Smith Island?
Smith Island is an island in Chesapeake Bay. And there are a number of, there used to be more of them, but some of them have disappeared as, we've had some sea level rise and bad storms and so on. But there's Smith and there's Tangier. And when I taught for the Audubon Naturalist Society in Chevy Chase, that was one thing I started. Actually, I started doing summer teaching for them before I retired. I taught elementary, and when parents were demanding stuff for the kids that outgrew elementary, they had no one who taught middle school. At that point, I was teaching middle school, so I helped them start a program. And I said, the first thing you need to do is get them out of here. I said, because they've been coming here since they were kindergarten. I said, they can give the tour here. What you need to think is, where does it go? And so we partnered with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I took kids to islands that the Bay Foundation owned. And it was Smith, Fox, Tangier, actually Port Isabel, which is right adjacent to Tangier, and Bishop's Head. There were 4 places that we went. Bishop's Head is only an island at high tide. Only an island at high tide. And I designed a 1-week trip, 2 days crash course to learn some basics. So when you go down, you don't make a fool of yourself. and then you have a little bit of baseline knowledge you can do something with. And then we would go leave on Wednesday and come back Friday afternoon. And at least somewhere between third and half the kids wanted to come back the next year because they had such a good time. And we had to take all our own food. And so, because I meant I had to buy it all. So it took 9 coolers to carry it, and you don't ever get on a boat with anything in a box because the boat is open, and if water comes on and you are sitting with food in a cardboard box, that does not work very well.
Yeah.
So everything went in a cooler. So we get there, we did make a chain line and pass it all till we get it up on the boat to go.
I'm trying to think of some more questions. We've talked about it a little bit before, but how do you see how climate change has affected you in your lifetime? Like, how have you experienced how climate change is going on?
Well, one of them is just the lack of cold winters. Now, this snow is kind of unusual. We've had 2 years where we had basically no snow. I mean, it may have snowed a few flurries or something, but no appreciable snow. I can remember when we usually had snow by Thanksgiving. And then it snowed during the winter. I mean, I have pictures taken my sister and myself playing in the snow on a sled. And there was a lot of it, but you don't see that much now. I know that there are pieces that they put on the end of the pier. They have them here, and most piers that have some age on them have them to keep, so when the river froze, it wouldn't pull the pilings up, that the pilings would stay put. And the river almost never freezes over now. It's been a long time since it really has frozen over. But people older than I could remember when you could go from Crisfield to Smith Island on skates.
Wow. That's a long ways.
Yeah, and I mean, you obviously couldn't do that anymore. And the boats had to be careful so they didn't get, frozen in the bay. Yeah. So all of that's different. And if you go to Smith Island, there are 3 towns. 2 of them are still connected, but all 3 used to be connected. And the climate change and sea level rise has stopped that. And so one of them, the one where I was based on when I was teaching down there, you can't get there anymore except by boat. You have to get on a boat to get there. But we used to take canoes and take kids up there, where there was a town right between the 2, and if you knew where to look, you could find things. And on that shelf, see those little medicine bottles? Mm-hmm. Those were brought back from there.
Oh wow!
Yeah, you could find stuff like that.
Yeah.
So those are totally identifiable, examples of concrete examples of how it's changed in my lifetime.
Yeah. To change the subject a little bit, I kind of want to go back to your mom and dive into the history a little bit of your family history. How your mom got an education because of her mom.
Yes. What would be my great grandparents, which would be your great great grandparents, had 3 sons and a daughter, and my grandmother was the daughter, and she wanted to go to college to be a teacher. And at that point it was called normal school, and it was only 2 years. And her father wouldn't, my great-grandfather, would not let her go. He said, that's not fitting for a woman. That was his comment. And he didn't see the value of it for a woman. And so she never had the opportunity. So her hope was that one of her children, she had 9, 2 died in infancy, 1 died as an adult. Her hope was that one of them would want to go to school. And my mother was the only one, your grandmother was the only one that answered the call. And the irony there is that my grandfather took her to Western Maryland College in September, and he died in January. And so that would have been the fall of 1930. This is, getting into the Depression stuff. And my grandmother fought tooth and nail to keep her in school. And you know it had to be hard. My mother tutored students to earn some extra money so she could get through. And her professors wanted her to go on to graduate school.
Because she graduated summa cum laude.
Yeah, but she didn't have any money. And she didn't have anything to go with.
And they weren't offering like giant scholarships like they do today.
Correct. So she came home. The first year she had 1 day of substitute work. And then a neighbor down the road who was a lawyer got her to tutor his son in math. And then he went to bat for her and helped her get a teaching position down here at Solomon's. So she boarded down here on weekdays and went home on the weekend.
And that's where she met your father?
Well, that's another interesting story because my father dated her sister, my aunt, before he dated her. And my aunt ran off with someone else, eloped with somebody else. So then he asked my mother out. So that's how that story came to be.
Oh, that's funny.
There was a lady here who died several months ago who is probably a third cousin if I figure it all out. I think I've given everybody a copy of the sheet of paper that all this is on. Who she used to write genealogy articles for the county paper. So while she was still living and while she still had, was fine mentally, I kind of picked her brain and she gave me some material, one of which was this paper that traced the family. And then we know that the original ancestor came in 1752 from England.
As a Quaker, right?
As a Quaker. And he was brought over by a Quaker. He and 2 other men were brought over. And they went to the Quaker meeting house. Well, he worked his 7 years and got his 50 acres of land and never looked back. The problem was, in this area, what were you going to do with your 50 acres of land? You were going to raise tobacco. What do you need to raise tobacco? Labor. Where were you going to get labor? Slaves. And if you had slaves, you could no longer go to the Quaker meeting house. So that's why there's this proliferation of Methodist churches here, because people had to do that in order to make a living, because you just did not have the labor to work the land.
But then I don't know if you would know this or not, but like around like the Civil War, when the Emancipation Proclamation in Maryland was part of the Union at that point.
Yes, Maryland was officially part of the Union, but Maryland was considered a border state, but parts of Maryland were like here, and the Eastern Shore were more like the South, whereas Northern Maryland was more like the North. So it's almost like the state was split in a sense. And I once went to a lecture where the person in charge of the archives for the state of Maryland had numbers, and there was a point in time where the black population in this county was larger than the white population. And you can see why. You know, somebody owned. But a large number of slaves in this county would have been 20 slaves. If you're down in
because it's smaller acres of farmland.
That's right. And if you go
it's
down
not
to
giant plantations.
Correct. So, you know, people think, Southern, when they think about the South, they think about these large plantations. And that's true. Those large plantations had, hundreds of acres. And so you needed a lot more slaves to work it. So this was like a mini version, if you will. So if you go through and look at the records, 20 slaves would have been a large number of slaves for somebody to own. And what's interesting is that, the slaves did not have surnames. And if they ever did, it got lost in the shuffle, as one says. So when emancipation occurred, a lot of the slaves took the surname of the people who had owned them. So in this county, there are certain names you can find, like Perrin, Makel. I'm trying to think of some more. Those two hit me right off the top. Even Hutchins. You can find black people who have that name and white people who have that name, that surname. But that's where it came from.
I think I want to take a little break in a second
because
we've been talking for a little bit.
Yeah,
we've been talking for a good bit now. But I just want to ask you. I love what you said about giving a gift to young people and all of that. But through your life experience, what would you say is a piece of advice you would give to a young person right now?
I would say be open to new experiences and don't ever be afraid to stand up for what you think is right, both for yourself and for others.
Yeah. That sounds about right. Sounds pretty good. All right, well, let's pause right there.
Okay. All right.